The base of the bonfire stack was 60 feet wide. 5,000 logs, stacked 59 feet high, weighing more than 2 million pounds. Students called it the wedding cake. Wider at the bottom, supposedly stable, built the same way since 1909. But at 2:42 a.m. on November 18th, 1999, physics didn't care about 90 years of tradition when the center pole snapped and 2 million pounds of timber collapsed inward in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. That's how long it took for a 90-year tradition to become the deadliest student organization event in American history. 12 students crushed to death. 27 hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. And in the investigation that followed, a paper trail that would prove every single death was preventable. This is the story of how a university sacrificed students to preserve tradition. How engineers who warned about structural failure were dismissed as not understanding Aggie spirit. And how the same center pole design that failed catastrophically in 1999 had nearly collapsed twice before. Warnings that Texas A&M filed away and forgot. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how 59 students ended up on a collapsing tower at nearly 3 in the morning, you need to understand what the bonfire meant to Texas A&M. The tradition started in 1909. A simple pile of trash and scrap wood burned before the annual football game against the University of Texas. By the 1920s, it had evolved into a competition. Which school could build the bigger bonfire? The Longhorns eventually abandoned the practice. The Aggies turned it into religion. By the 1990s, bonfire construction consumed the campus each fall. Thousands of students participated. Cutting trees in the forest, hauling logs to campus, stacking them into the massive wedding cake structure that dominated Duncan Field. Meanwhile, the design kept getting more ambitious. In 1969, the stack reached 45 feet. By 1984, 55 feet. In 1994, they pushed it to 59 feet, nearly 6 stories tall. Each year trying to outdo the last. Each year adding more logs, more weight, more height. But here's what changed. Actually, here's what didn't change. The engineering. The center pole remained the same diameter it had been since the 1950s. A single telephone pole, roughly 14 inches thick at the base, expected to support exponentially increasing weight as the design grew taller and heavier. And students noticed problems. In 1994, during construction, the center pole began bowing visibly. Students on the stack reported feeling it shift. The structure was leaning. Not a little. Enough that people on the ground could see it with naked eyes. So what did Texas A&M do? They called in riggers, professionals who work with heavy equipment and cranes. The riggers assessed the situation and delivered a blunt message. This thing is unstable. It could collapse. You need to stop construction immediately and redesign the support system. The university's response would set the pattern for the next 5 years. They ignored the professionals. Instead, they had students cable the center pole to the ground with steel wires, creating tension to hold it upright. A band-aid fix. Treating symptoms instead of addressing the fundamental design flaw. The center pole was too thin for the weight it was supporting. But the bonfire didn't collapse in 1994. So Texas A&M declared the problem solved. The tradition would continue. Then came 1997. Once again, during construction, the center pole began bowing. Once again, visible lean. Students reported that standing on the upper tiers felt unstable, like the whole structure was swaying. And once again, the university brought in outside help. This time, structural engineers. Professionals who understood load-bearing capacity, compression forces, lateral stability, all the physics that student tradition builders didn't. The engineers were horrified. They documented severe structural deficiencies. The center pole was inadequate for the load. The cable tensioning system was creating compression points that could fail catastrophically. The logs on previous year's stacks, some dating back 5 or 6 years because students incorporated old wood into new builds, were deteriorating, weakening the overall integrity. Most critically, the engineers warned that if the center pole failed, the entire stack would collapse inward, not tip over, not gradually settle, collapse catastrophically, with anyone on the structure falling through disintegrating timber. They put this in writing. An 87-page report delivered to Texas A&M's Risk Management Office in 1998. The document laid out specific failure scenarios. It recommended immediate redesign of the center pole support system. It suggested independent engineering review before each construction. And most importantly, it warned that without structural changes, collapse was not a question of if, but when. The university filed the report and did nothing because, you see, bringing in engineers would mean admitting the students didn't know what they were doing. It would mean acknowledging that 90 years of tradition had created a fundamentally unsafe structure. It would mean, heaven forbid, potentially making the bonfire smaller or changing the design. So, instead, Texas A&M doubled down on tradition. The 1999 bonfire construction began in October with the annual cut. Thousands of students descended on the forest, chainsawing trees, loading logs onto trucks. It was positioned as character building. Teamwork, the Aggie spirit in action. What it actually was: unpaid labor under dangerous conditions with zero safety oversight. Students operated chainsaws with minimal training, hauled multi-ton loads in overloaded trucks, worked through the night on adrenaline and school pride. Meanwhile, back on campus, construction of the stack began. The wedding cake design required precise coordination. Bottom tier, called the center pole, built directly around the single central pole. Logs laid in alternating layers, each tier smaller than the one below, creating the stepped pyramid shape. Students called the different levels by name. First stack, second stack, all the way up to the upper tiers, where the structure narrowed to just a few feet wide, nearly 60 feet in the air. And here's where the competitive culture became deadly. Different student organizations, Corps of Discovery, Parsons Mounted Cavalry, various other groups, competed to work the highest, most dangerous positions. Being on the upper tiers meant you were dedicated, hardcore, a real Aggie. Freshmen especially pushed to prove themselves, climbing higher, working longer shifts, taking more risks, because questioning safety was seen as weakness. Suggesting the structure might be unstable meant you didn't understand tradition. You weren't committed. This cultural pressure was enforced by upperclassmen called red pots, student leaders who wore red hard hats and coordinated construction. But notably, Regular workers didn't wear hard hats. No safety equipment. No harnesses. Students climbed 59 feet up a structure built without engineering oversight, and the only thing between them and a fatal fall was tradition's promise that it was safe. Meanwhile, the construction schedule was accelerating. In previous years, bonfire construction took weeks. In 1999, they were pushing to finish in 8 days. Why? Competition with previous years, pride in working faster, and less tangibly, a sense that showing concern about the compressed timeline meant you were soft. By November the 17th, the stack was nearly complete. 59 feet tall, 5,000 logs. Weight estimated at over 2 million pounds, though nobody had actually calculated it. The center pole, still just 14 inches in diameter, was supporting all of it. Students had wired it to the ground with cables, just like in 94 and 97. But this year's stack was heavier than previous years, taller, more logs per tier. The physics were unforgiving. That evening, construction continued into the night. This was normal. Bonfire work often ran until 3 or 4 a.m., students working in shifts, competing to see who could stay longest. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on November 18th, 59 students were on the stack, some on lower tiers, repositioning logs, others climbing the upper levels, adding finishing touches. Among them was 18-year-old Miranda Adams, a freshman from Houston. She'd been working bonfire for weeks, determined to prove herself. Her parents had dropped her at college 3 months earlier, proud their daughter was attending their alma mater, carrying on family tradition. Also on the stack, 20-year-old Tim Curley, a junior who'd worked bonfire every year since freshman orientation. 21-year-old John Comstock, up on the second stack, 20 feet off the ground. 19-year-old Jeremy Frampton, even higher. These weren't reckless kids ignoring obvious danger. They were students doing exactly what the university encouraged, what 90 years of tradition told them was safe, what upperclassmen and administrators assured them was part of the Aggie experience. At 2:42 a.m., physics delivered its verdict. The center pole, subjected to compression forces it was never designed to handle, buckled. Not gradually, catastrophically. The upper section snapped, and with the center pole gone, 2 million pounds of timber had nothing holding it up. The stack began collapsing inward, each tier falling onto the one below, creating a progressive failure that accelerated as it fell. 59 students were suddenly falling through disintegrating structure. Campus police officer Willie Smith heard it from half a mile away. A sustained roar, like a freight train derailing. By the time he reached Duncan Field, the 5-story tower was a crater of splintered logs with students screaming underneath. The scene was chaos. Timber everywhere. Some logs 40 feet long, weighing hundreds of pounds each, stacked in an unstable pile with people trapped underneath. And the survivors who'd been thrown clear were screaming because they could hear their friends under the debris. Conscious. Calling for help. But here's the nightmare of the rescue attempt. You couldn't just start pulling logs off. The pile was unstable. Moving the wrong log could shift the entire mass, crushing whoever was trapped underneath. Rescuers needed to carefully assess each piece, determine what was load-bearing, figure out how to extract it without causing secondary collapse. Meanwhile, students were dying. Some from massive trauma, logs that weighed hundreds of pounds landing directly on them, others from compression injuries, the weight of the debris above crushing their chest cavities, preventing them from breathing. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Ambulances, fire trucks, medical helicopters. But they faced an impossible situation. 59 students had been on that stack. Some were walking wounded, thrown clear during the collapse. Others were trapped in voids within the debris pile, alive but unreachable. And some were already dead, crushed instantly when the structure came down. The rescue operation would continue for more than 12 hours. Meanwhile, word was spreading across campus. Cell phones in 1999 weren't ubiquitous like today, but enough students had them that calls were going out. Parents being woken at 3 a.m. with news that their child was in a collapsed bonfire. Families racing to College Station with no information about whether their student was dead or alive. And Texas A&M administrators facing the reality that their 90-year tradition had just killed their own students. The final casualty count was devastating. 12 dead. Miranda Adams, the freshman from Houston, killed instantly. Tim Curley, the junior who'd worked every bonfire, crushed under multiple logs. Jeremy Frampton, pulled from the debris alive but died from internal injuries hours later. 27 others hospitalized with serious injuries. Crushed vertebrae, broken backs, collapsed lungs, traumatic amputations where logs had severed limbs, and dozens more with psychological trauma from watching their friends die. But as tragic as the casualty count was, what made the story truly horrifying was what investigators discovered in the days that followed. This wasn't an unforeseeable accident. It wasn't a freak occurrence. It was exactly what the engineers had warned would happen. The investigation began immediately. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, sent investigators. The Texas Commission on Fire Protection got involved, and Texas A&M, facing massive liability exposure, commissioned their own independent investigation. What they found was damning. The center pole had failed precisely as predicted in the 1998 engineering report. The compression forces from the weight above, combined with lateral forces from the cable tensioning system, had exceeded the pole's capacity. It didn't gradually bend or slowly give way. It snapped. Sudden structural failure. And once the center pole was gone, the entire stack collapsed inward in the exact scenario the engineers had described. Then investigators found the paper trail, the 1994 rigor warnings, documented, the 1997 engineering concerns, on file, the 1998 structural analysis report, sitting in risk management, 87 pages of specific warnings about center pole failure. Texas A&M had documentation going back 5 years that this exact scenario could happen. They'd been explicitly warned by multiple professionals that the structure was unsafe, and they'd done nothing. Instead, the university had relied on student tradition. The argument was literally, "We've been doing it this way for 90 years. As if longevity equals safety. As if the fact that the structure hadn't collapsed yet meant it never would. This is survivorship bias taken to its most lethal extreme. The 100 previous bonfires that didn't collapse don't prove the structure was safe. They prove you got lucky, until your luck runs out." The university's insurance records revealed even more disturbing information. Texas A&M had been paying increasing premiums for bonfire-related liability coverage throughout the 1990s. The insurance company had classified bonfire construction as high-risk activity. They'd specifically flagged the lack of engineering oversight and the increasing height of the structure as concerns. In other words, even the insurance industry knew this was dangerous. They were charging accordingly. And Texas A&M was paying those premiums while simultaneously telling students the bonfire was safe. Meanwhile, survivor testimony painted a picture of systemic negligence. Students reported that Red Pots, the student leaders, actively discouraged safety concerns. If you mentioned that the structure felt unstable, you were told you were being paranoid. If you suggested they should slow down construction, you were accused of not having Aggie spirit. The culture had evolved to treat safety consciousness as betrayal of tradition. Students who wanted to stop working when they felt unsafe were shamed into continuing. One survivor described being on the upper tiers when he noticed the center pole bowing. He mentioned it to a Red Pot, suggesting maybe they should get off the stack and have someone check it. The Red Pot's response? "It's been leaning since we started building. That's normal. If you're scared, you can leave." But real Aggies aren't afraid. 20 minutes later, the structure collapsed. The Red Pot who'd dismissed the concern was killed. The student who raised it survived because he'd climbed down. The OSHA investigation issued formal findings in March 2000. They cited Texas A&M for multiple violations: failure to conduct structural engineering analysis before construction, failure to provide adequate safety equipment, failure to implement safety protocols for work at elevation. But beyond the technical violations, the report included a scathing assessment of the university's decision-making. OSHA specifically noted that Texas A&M had received professional engineering warnings in 1997 and 98 and had failed to act on them. Then came the Special Commission on the 1999 Texas A&M bonfire, appointed by the state to investigate beyond just OSHA compliance. This commission had broader authority to examine institutional decision-making, cultural factors, and administrative responsibility. Their final report, released in May 2000, was devastating. The commission found that the bonfire tradition had evolved into what they called a structural accident waiting to happen. The report documented that the bonfire design had no formal engineering oversight at any point. Student tradition builders learned from previous student tradition builders, passing down construction methods that had never been professionally evaluated. As the structure grew taller and heavier over decades, nobody recalculated load capacities or structural requirements. It was purely empirical. If last year's didn't collapse, this year's design is fine. Until it wasn't. More damning, the commission found that Texas A&M administrators all knew about the risks and actively chose to ignore them. The university's own risk management office had the engineering reports. They'd been briefed on structural concerns. And they'd made a conscious decision to continue the tradition without implementing recommended safety measures. Why? Because changing the bonfire meant admitting it had been unsafe. It meant acknowledging that the university had been putting students at risk for years. It meant potentially facing liability for previous near collapses. The commission interviewed administrators who'd received the engineering warnings. Their explanations were stunning in their inadequacy. One official testified that he'd read the 1998 report, but didn't think it required immediate action because the bonfire had never collapsed before. Another stated that implementing engineering oversight would change the nature of the tradition by making it less student-driven. A third admitted that there was concern about liability exposure if they acknowledged the structure was unsafe. So, they chose not to acknowledge it. Let that sink in for a moment. University officials were worried that admitting the bonfire was dangerous would expose them to liability. So, instead of fixing the problem, they hid from it. They prioritized protecting the institution over protecting students. And 12 students died as a result. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were grappling with impossible grief. Parents who'd sent their children to college expecting them to be safe. Miranda Adams' mother testified before the commission about receiving the phone call at 3:15 a.m. The hospital telling her that her daughter was deceased, killed in a bonfire collapse. She'd had no idea Miranda was even working on the bonfire that night. Tim Curley's father described showing up at the hospital to find his son in a body bag. The medical examiner explaining that Tim had been crushed when the initial collapse occurred, death likely instantaneous. But his body hadn't been recovered for 7 hours because he was buried under tons of timber. 7 hours of hoping maybe he was alive in a void somewhere, only to learn he'd been dead the entire time. The survivor testimonies were equally haunting. Students who'd been on the stack when it collapsed describing the sensation of falling through disintegrating structure. Hitting logs, falling further, more impacts, everything happening too fast to process. Then silence. Being trapped in darkness with timber all around, unable to move, hearing screams from other people trapped nearby. One survivor described being pinned under a log across his chest, conscious but unable to breathe properly. He could hear rescuers above him, but couldn't call out because the pressure on his chest prevented him from drawing enough air. He was trapped like that for 4 hours before they reached him. Another student described watching his friend die. They were trapped near each other in the debris pile. His friend had a massive head injury, bleeding badly. The student could talk to him, try to keep him conscious, but couldn't reach him to help. Over the course of 3 hours, he watched his friend become less responsive, heard his breathing become labored, and eventually watched him die while rescuers worked desperately above them, unable to reach either student in time. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Multiple students developed PTSD. Flashbacks to the collapse, panic attacks triggered by loud noises, survivors' guilt over being alive when friends died. Several required years of therapy. Some transferred to other universities, unable to stay at Texas A&M. The campus itself felt haunted to them. Walking past Duncan Field where it happened, seeing memorials to the victims, being reminded constantly of the trauma. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was how the university handled the aftermath. In the immediate days after the collapse, Texas A&M administrators made public statements emphasizing the tragedy while defending the tradition. They talked about bonfire being part of the Aggie spirit. They suggested the collapse was an unforeseeable accident. University President Ray Bowen initially indicated that bonfire would continue after safety improvements were implemented. This enraged the victims' families. Their children were dead because the university ignored safety warnings. And the administration's first response was to preserve the tradition that killed them. The families organized. They demanded accountability. They pushed for the independent investigation. And crucially, They fought against Texas A&M's narrative that this was an unforeseeable tragedy. It was entirely foreseeable. Professionals had literally foreseen it in writing years before it happened. As the investigations progressed and the evidence emerged, the university's position became untenable. The engineering reports from 97 and 98 became public. The insurance documentation surfaced. Survivor testimony contradicted the administration's claims. Media coverage intensified, and Texas A&M faced a fundamental question. How do you maintain a tradition after it kills 12 people because you ignored warnings that it would kill people? In April 2000, President Bowen announced that the bonfire tradition would be suspended indefinitely pending the investigation results. When the Special Commission's report was released in May, its recommendations were clear. The bonfire could not continue in its previous form. If Texas A&M wanted to maintain the tradition, it would require complete redesign with professional engineering oversight, formal safety protocols, and fundamental changes to the construction culture. The university faced a choice: implement those changes and continue bonfire, or end the tradition. In June 2000, the Board of Regents voted to discontinue the official bonfire permanently. The 91-year tradition was over. The decision was controversial among students and alumni. Many felt that ending bonfire punished everyone for an accident. They argued the tradition could be fixed, made safer, continued with proper oversight. But the families of the victims saw it differently. This wasn't punishment. This was accountability. The bonfire didn't kill their children because of an accident. It killed them because the university chose tradition over safety, chose institutional pride over student welfare, chose to ignore professional warnings because acknowledging them would be inconvenient. Ending the tradition wasn't punishment. It was recognition that some things aren't worth dying for. The legal aftermath was extensive. Multiple lawsuits filed against Texas A&M. Families seeking damages for wrongful death. Survivors suing for injuries and psychological trauma. The university settled most cases out of court with confidential agreements. But the financial cost was enormous. Estimates suggest Texas A&M paid over $10 million in settlements and legal fees. More significantly, the collapse led to national scrutiny of student traditions at universities across the country. Other schools with similar high-risk traditional events began implementing safety reviews. Several discontinued their traditions rather than face liability. The Texas A&M bonfire became a case study in institutional negligence, taught in engineering programs and risk management courses as an example of how organizational culture can override safety concerns with fatal results. Meanwhile, a group of students refused to let the tradition die. They organized off-campus bonfire construction, independent of university oversight. Called Student Bonfire, this unsanctioned event continues today. The university officially disapproves, but can't prevent students from building fires on private property. Ironically, the student-organized bonfire implemented many of the safety measures the official bonfire lacked: professional engineering review, formal safety equipment requirements, structural inspections. The tradition that the university couldn't make safe, students made safe themselves once freed from institutional denial. Today, Duncan Field features a memorial to the 12 students who died. 12 portals, one for each victim, designed as symbolic entry points to memory. The memorial was dedicated in November 2004, 5 years after the collapse. Families of the victims spoke at the dedication. Their message was consistent. Remember our children. Learn from this tragedy. Never prioritize tradition over safety. The broader lessons from the Texas A&M bonfire collapse extend far beyond college traditions. This is a case study in institutional failure. How organizations become invested in narratives that contradict reality. How cultural pressure suppresses safety concerns. How authority figures dismiss expert warnings when those warnings threaten institutional priorities. These patterns appear repeatedly across disasters. The parallels to other catastrophes are striking. Like the Challenger disaster, where engineers warned about O-ring failure in cold temperatures and were overruled by managers focused on launch schedules. Like the Columbia disaster, where safety concerns about foam strikes were dismissed because previous missions had survived them. Like Aberfan, where warnings about coal waste stability were ignored until a landslide buried a school. The specific technologies differ, but the organizational dysfunction is identical. In every case you see the same pattern. Experts identify a problem. They document it. They warn decision-makers. And the decision-makers, invested in maintaining current operations, dismiss the warnings as overly cautious or not understanding the full picture, until the disaster proves the experts were right. And by then, people are dead. The Texas A&M bonfire killed 12 students because administrators decided that 90 years of tradition trumped professional engineering analysis. They had the warnings, they had the documentation, they knew the risks, and they chose to proceed anyway, betting that the structure would hold one more time. They lost that bet. 12 families buried their children as a result. What makes this particularly infuriating is that the students who died trusted the institution. They weren't ignoring safety warnings. The warnings never reached them. The university told them bonfire was safe. Tradition said it was safe. Upperclassmen said it was safe. Every message they received from authority figures was that this was a normal, acceptable activity. They died because the adults in charge lied to them about the risks. This is the core betrayal. Texas. A&M had a duty to protect its students. When engineers said the bonfire was unsafe, the university had an obligation to act on that information. Instead, they filed the reports and pretended the problem didn't exist. They prioritized avoiding controversy over preventing deaths. And when the collapse happened exactly as predicted, they initially tried to frame it as an unforeseeable tragedy, rather than the inevitable result of ignored warnings. The victims' families fought against that narrative. They demanded accountability. They pushed for investigations that revealed the truth. And ultimately, they forced the university to acknowledge what happened. Institutional negligence killed their children. Not an accident, not a freak occurrence. A preventable catastrophe that happened because people in authority chose tradition over safety. The bonfire tradition is gone now, but the memorial stands, 12 portals representing 12 lives cut short. Students who went to college to learn, to grow, to build futures, who died instead, crushed under 2 million pounds of timber that engineers had warned would collapse. Their deaths weren't meaningless. The investigations, the safety reforms, the lessons learned have prevented similar tragedies elsewhere. But Their deaths were preventable. That's what makes this story not just tragic, but enraging. 25 years later, the question remains: what was 91 years of tradition worth? Was it worth 12 lives? Was it worth 27 serious injuries? Was it worth the trauma inflicted on hundreds of survivors and witnesses? Texas. A&M's administration in 1999 clearly thought tradition was worth the risk. They read the engineering report's warning of catastrophic failure and decided to proceed anyway. And on November 18th at 2:42 a.m., reality delivered its judgment. Physics didn't care about 90 years of tradition. The center pole couldn't support the weight, regardless of how many previous years it had held. And when it snapped, 2 million pounds of timber collapsed inward in 11 seconds, exactly as the engineers had predicted it would. 12 students died, proving the experts right. That's the lesson. Not about bonfire construction specifically, but about institutional decision-making. When professionals warn you something is unsafe, you listen. When engineers document failure scenarios, you act on them. When tradition conflicts with safety, safety wins. Because the alternative is what happened at Texas A&M. 12 families destroyed. 27 students permanently injured. Hundreds traumatized. An entire university forced to confront its complicity in preventable deaths. And a 91-year tradition ended in disgrace, remembered not for school spirit, but for the students it killed when administrators chose pride over prudence. The base of the bonfire stack was 60 feet wide, 5,000 logs, stacked 59 feet high, weighing more than 2 million pounds. Students called it the wedding cake. Administrators called it tradition. Engineers called it unsafe. And at 2:42 a.m. on November 18th, 1999, physics called it catastrophic structural failure. 12 students died in the 11 seconds it took to collapse. The warnings had been ignored for years. The experts had been dismissed as not understanding Aggie spirit. And when the center pole snapped, tradition couldn't hold up 2 million pounds any better than a 14-inch telephone pole could. They said tradition made it safe. Then the tower crushed their own students, and the engineers who'd warned it would happen were proven right, at a cost of 12 young lives that should never have been lost.